Okay, welcome everybody to the MIDRC seminar of the month of May. We've been having these monthly seminars on the second Tuesday of the month, and today's topic will be creating better data sets through population biomarkers, and it will be presented by Dr. Atherosclerosis, who is a board-certified diagnostic radiologist as well as a neuroradiologist. He's also board-certified in clinical informatics, and he graduated from Jefferson College. After that, he did a fellowship at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He has served on the RSNA Informatics Committee and currently serves on the ARRS Informatics Committee. His research focuses on utilizing imaging biomarkers to help manage patient populations, which is very much the topic of today's talk. So Ais, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So my talk today will be about creating better data sets through population biomarkers. As mentioned, I'm Ais Piros. By day, I work as a neuroradiologist, and by night, I toil away at computers and work in clinical informatics. Duly Healthcare is a large ambulatory system outside the city of Chicago. I live in the western suburbs. And so let's begin. My only disclosure is that the research in this talk is a part of MIDRC. I have no other disclosures. So the outline for my talk today and the purpose is to convince you that radiology is the foundation for population health. There is a slow decline in death for fee-for-service healthcare in the US, and that's going to be replaced by a value-based healthcare system. And we're going to talk about how these specific codes used in value-based healthcare payments can create better data for machine learning and be used for feature and data engineering. And then we're going to go through some examples of how AI and biomarkers are really the future of value-based care and hopefully the future of healthcare in general. Some of the examples we're going to talk about, we're going to relate to COVID-19, diabetes predictions, health disparity detection, and we're going to focus on chest x-rays. So there'll be some take-home points at the end. So radiology really is population health. For anyone that's a radiologist in the audience virtually, if you practice, you know that the volume of studies we deal with is immense. And radiology is really at the center of this referral network. Here we have a graph, a map showing us how radiologists are related to other providers in the healthcare system based on Medicare's claims data. And there's over 200 million patients alone connections shared between providers in the year 2011. So radiologists see the most unique Medicare beneficiaries of 56 specialties, the largest being for mammography. So we truly are dealing with a sheer and intense number of patients. This right here looks like probably I'm advertising for a wireless cell phone coverage, 5G, and that's not at all what it is. It's a geographic graph of shared Medicare beneficiaries between radiology groups and providers. And you can see there's 1.7 million connections, and this is in 2017, between providers and radiology groups. The radiology network is large and complicated, and it really corresponds with population density throughout the country. So we have immense and vast coverage. So to sum it up, for radiology for population health, really radiology has incredible reach. We deal with a tremendous number of patients. And I kind of make this point, and I don't make a bad comparison here, but we are kind of like McDonald's, right? They stopped counting at 99 billion. So at some point, we're probably going to stop counting, but we serve a tremendous number of patients. So fee-for-service medicine is what we all think about when we go to the doctor. We hear about it's changing, it's dying. And for some of you that don't work in healthcare directly, you may not know what's coming or why it's changing to a certain extent. And the reason why fee-for-service is changing is because, simply put, it costs too much money. The US is one of the world's leading spenders on healthcare. Nearly 20% of GDP now goes to healthcare, almost $1 in $5, which is almost, it's clearly unsustainable, and it's continuing to grow at a rate that cannot be sustained. So what costs all this money? And really, when you break down the costs, a significant component of the cost is attributable to modifiable risk factors in the US. So about 730 billion, which is not all of it. And actually, maybe not even half of it we can consider to be something that we can attribute to modifiable factors. But the point is that a significant amount of these things are comorbidities like diabetes, obesity, that contribute to the cost of care. And so we understand that there are many modifiable risk factors, but a small number of patients end up consuming the majority or almost the majority of resources. So they call these high need, high cost patients. So patients that are very sick, with the top 5% of healthcare spenders accounting for more than half the total $3.2 trillion in healthcare spending. So it's obviously an overwhelming problem. So what's coming next? How do we fix this problem? And this is where value-based care comes in. The definition of value-based healthcare is a healthcare delivery model in which providers, including hospitals and physicians, are paid on patient health outcomes. So what does this really mean? What are we really talking about? In the US, when people are talking about value-based care, we're talking about Medicare Advantage. Part C refers to, you can think of it as being combo. It's really a combination of A, B, and sometimes D. And this is a capitated system. There's been tremendous growth of Medicare Advantage in the US in the last 20 years, from roughly 18% to around 40% of Medicare beneficiaries now being enrolled. Medicare Advantage is a part of alternative payment models. There was a recent survey in 2020 that showed that 40% of healthcare payments are tied now to alternative payment models, the largest being Medicare Advantage. So it's out of the 62 million people that are enrolled in Medicare, 41% are now in Medicare Advantage. And so how do the payments happen? What's going on here? So the system by which Medicare pays for patient care in Medicare Advantage is dictated by this hierarchical condition category codes. And so we all probably heard of ICD-10 codes. These are diagnosis codes that almost everyone gets anytime they see a doctor. Headache, back pain. These are all assignable diagnosis codes. But what CMS is looking to pay for are chronic conditions that need obvious money and resources to pay for to be managed. And these are a subset of these ICD-10 codes that map to 86 disease categories. And they call these typically HCC codes. Unfortunately, they're poorly named because sometimes people think we're talking about cancer or hepatocellular cancer, but it's not. But the system somewhat resembles the Charlson Comorbidity Index, if you've ever heard of that before. The point of the system really is to prevent cherry picking and lemon dropping. So in value-based healthcare systems, the tendency is to drop patients maybe that have too much disease if they're not getting paid enough, or pick only cherry pick patients that are healthy. And that's the point of this, is to basically allow providers to take patients, and if they are sick or require more resources, to be compensated fairly for that. They are updated yearly. The payments basically then run through this kind of somewhat complicated system, but basically are almost in all cases reviewed by a clinical documentation improvement team, meaning that in many cases, if your hospital or system is using value-based healthcare, they have a team of coders that will go through and review these codes to make sure that they're accurate. And this is a part of some of the CMS requirements for this. And this makes them an excellent resource for machine learning, for supervised learning specifically. And you can see here some examples of how this works. There are multiple ICD-10 codes, and they're all grouped together into a single category. So getting a little bit of details, I apologize. I know this is not maybe the most exciting thing, but we're going to give you an example of how this really works. So here we have a patient who has several diagnoses. These are the ICD-10 codes. These are the categories they map to and the description, and then the coefficient. The coefficient really represents how much payment should be assigned, how much weight. And so we can see here, for example, that this patient has two codes that are related to diabetes. Yours is in the same hierarchy. So codes in the same hierarchy, meaning they're somewhat related. And CMS doesn't want you to double dip or basically bill twice for this. So what they've done is said, okay, if the patient, let's say, has diabetes with chronic complications, this will basically supersede or take over the without complications. The end result is that these codes then are added up, and you'll notice here there's a disease interaction. So certain codes, for example, diabetes and CHF, will get a little extra boost to cover additional expenses. So this gives this total RAF score. The total RAF score then is multiplied by this benchmark rate. And this basically is a payment to a plan or healthcare system to cover the cost for this patient. So this is how it actually works. We have two examples here. The one in the left column is a patient who is 65 years old, has rheumatoid arthritis, but otherwise healthy. So they have this risk adjustment score, 0.744. There's this capitation rate. And essentially, this breaks down to a final monthly payment of $626. The patient on the right is 88-year-old male, has lung cancer, diabetes, macular degeneration, depression, with a much higher RAF score of 2.8. And so that results in a monthly payment to the plan of about $2,500. So what happens if a healthcare system spends more money on patient care than these plans provide? Money is lost. And this is the concept of shared risk or full risk, that there's basically skin in the game on both sides. And it makes it also very important to identify these high need, high cost patients. Now, to emphasize, it's not just about codes. We can't generate codes and magically get paid. CMS has strict guidelines and rules, one of which is something called MEET, meaning that a physician has to see the patient typically on a yearly basis through what they call annual health assessments or annual wellness visits. And it's a document. So if there is, for example, atherosclerosis, they have to monitor it, they have to evaluate it, they have to assess, and they form a treatment plan. So all this is required. So a radiologist, for example, can't come in and just start saying, I think they have the following codes. There needs to be really a team approach to these. So what? At this point, you're wondering, what are we talking about here? What does it do with biomarkers and radiology? The reason why I'm talking about this is because many of these diagnoses can be found in radiology. Emphysema can be seen on chest x-rays and CTs of the chest, aortic atherosclerosis, aortic aneurysms, breast, prostate, and other cancers, cardiac arrhythmias, osteoporosis. So there's a tremendous amount of information that we have in radiology that can help in the management of these patients. AI imaging biomarkers can help detect these patients and manage these conditions. So this is the idea of the concept of opportunistic detection of disease. So AI is deterministic. It can give the same result every time. Humans are somewhat stochastic. We sometimes report findings, we don't, for incidental maybe. AI is fast. We can process many patients, large populations in a day. AI can add value. Early detection possibly can lead to better management outcomes. And then there's some other uses too. Maybe we can look for fraud or health disparities. So this is the promise of using AI in this setting. Why am I interested in chest radiographs? Well, some of the leading causes of mortality are found in the chest: cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, COPD. It's the most common, one of the most common radiological exams paid for in Medicare beneficiaries. About 26 million chest x-rays were paid for by CMS. We have a lot of this data lying around on systems. And it's a powerful biomarker. So we know that we can predict healthcare costs. There are studies that have shown this. Someone has done work on using deep learning to predict biological age from a chest x-ray, predict mortality, predict comorbidities, and you can even predict these codes we're discussing, and also health disparities. So this is a model that we implemented in our practice. And what this is basically a multitask learner where we train the model on these HCC codes. And basically from one chest x-ray, we can predict 6 disease categories, including also RAF score. So congestive heart failure is this HCC 85 code, arrhythmias, morbid obesity, COPD, vascular disease, and diabetes. And we can see how the saliency maps show the activations differ in each of these results. For example, in CHF, we can see obviously that there's increased emphasis on the heart. The lungs are more activated in COPD. Vascular disease seems to show more activation at the aortic neuron. And diabetes is kind of a combination of things where we're actually picking up on various signals in the cardiomediastinal structures, including the axillary fat, so body habitus, which is known to contribute to diabetes diagnoses. Here's an example of how this looks. So here we have a representative output of the model. The model basically produces these predictions, which essentially we can treat them as probabilities. And we can see here, for example, these are the saliency maps associated with 2 of these predictions in a single patient. So we can take those numbers and then do something else with them. So we can take these biomarkers, these probabilities predicted from the image, and then we can predict something else. So for example, we did a study where we took these predictors on patients who had COVID, put them into a logistic regression model, and see how they perform. In this case, we actually started off by looking at our own population, ambulatory population, and then a hospitalized cohort. And the interesting thing about this study was we found that using a completely different institutions, in this case, this is a hospital UIC, which is in Chicago, they were able to take their codes from their EMR, and we were able to verify that the model had a predictive result, even though it's a different system from ours. We use Epic, they use Cerner. And they were actually using portable radiographs. This result was still able to be obtained. So we were able to obtain a validation set that was separate from our own. This is what it looked like. So this is the internal cohort, my ambulatory patient set in our practice, who were obviously typically healthier patients. And then this external cohort in Chicago, which was a typically sicker population. And we can see occlusion mapping showing similar activation, or actually similar characteristics as compared to the internal and external population. So we can see the model kind of has a generalizability, which is sometimes difficult to show in many of these deep learning deep vision models. So what we can do then is take these deep learning predictors and then model them to an outcome. And so in this case, we wanted to see about mortality. So using just these predictors, ignoring anything else, for example, the lung opacity, we can predict the likelihood of someone having, a fatal outcome from COVID. And it worked in both our population and the external population, the hospitalized cohort. And we see that the overall combined area of the curve is 0.84, which is respectable compared to other models that have been done. Another approach to this is to combine the comorbidity predictors, the scores, with other predictors. So for example, we could use a model that predicts how opacified the lungs are. So the greater degree of opacification would obviously be a higher score. This can be also modeled. And we did this to look at our ambulatory population. What we know is that basically patients that had COVID-19 early on didn't have, in the disease process, didn't have a significant amount of opacification of the lungs. So early infections, as we see typically in an outpatient setting, weren't as sick. And we could see that basically our model, the combined model, performed better, but basically the opacity score, which was this line here, number C, wasn't as good as a comorbidity model, but combining the two actually did produce a better result overall. So we basically are able to combine these different markers to basically get a better result in predicting who would need hospitalization in this setting. So opportunistic connection, I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the other opportunities with using deep learning models like this. And this is a lot of this work has been done by Perry Pickhart at the University of Wisconsin. And he has basically published this just recently about using CT imaging of the abdomen to make a prediction about diabetes risk or diabetes in general. And he's done work also with metabolic syndrome. So we did the study internally, again, using a very similar model, which I just described before, where we took a chest radiograph, because it's one of the most frequently ordered exams, and ran it against a large population of 104,000 patients. The methods are basically what we described before. I won't get into too much detail, but in this case, we do use the IC10 codes plus some additional biomarkers, A1C, which is a lab value that helps establish the diagnosis of diabetes. And we excluded some patients that basically didn't have a diagnosis predating the X-ray and with a less than a year follow-up. So the results were that we had over 100,000 patients in this sample set, and with a mean age of 53. We evaluated with 9,000 of those patients having a diagnosis of diabetes. This we were able to produce this area of the curve from the deep learning predictor, and it had an AUC of 0.819, which is basically very similar to some other models using laboratory values, even some using whole body imaging. So it's a result that we would think is actually decent in this case, to put it nicely. And we compare this to other predictors. For example, social deprivation index. This is called the SDI. And so the SDI basically measures how deprived someone is living in a poor neighborhood. And this has been known to be associated with diabetes. And in this case, it was a very poor predictor. We also tried using BMI, how a patient's body mass, again, not a very good predictor, better than the SDI, but not a very good predictor. And so if we just simply pick a threshold, the best point on the curve, this is like called the J statistic or Newton index, we can see the sensitivity for the model is 79%, specificity 69%, and the negative predictive value 97%, and the positive predictive value 20%. So when we look at that threshold, we say, okay, patients that were above this threshold for the prediction of diabetes, what can we see about them? What are the characteristics we can find? And what we see here is that of the patients that had the higher threshold, there were 37,000. 20% of them had a diagnosis of diabetes, which is good. Another 22% had prediabetes, meaning they had an A1C value that was between 5.7 and 6.4%. So these were patients basically that were probably considered at higher risk, did get an A1C ordered by the physician, obviously, and they were basically in a pre-diabetic spectrum of disease. So once you get to 6.5, that magical number, the patient then is considered to have diabetes. Then we also see what's very interesting is that we have a significant number of 37% that had no A1C value. So 13,000 of those patients above that threshold did not have an A1C value. So this is an opportunity maybe for a deep learning model to prompt a physician maybe to take action, that this patient, maybe should get seen and get evaluated for diabetes, maybe get A1C to further evaluate. And this is the days, this is the number of days between the chest x-ray and the diagnosis for diabetes. So we had 9,000 patients in the set that had diabetes, and the average mean for the number of days between the chest x-ray to diabetes diagnosis was 1,000 days. So significant. And then you can see even beyond that, there are patients out here to 4,000 or almost 5,000 days before they get a diagnosis. So clearly, the point being is that there's a wide spectrum to how we diagnose this in terms of time, and it can take a considerable amount of time to get the diagnosis, which means that patients are probably getting adequate care in a timely fashion. So how does this look? This is for the diabetes prediction. And these are, again, inclusion maps, which show us what parts of the model thought were important. And as you'd imagine, it has to do much with the shape, the habitus of the patient. So we can see that activation here, for example, in the axillary regions, the lower neck, these are important areas the model is detecting that can be attributed to this diagnosis. The patient on the left had a high score at 0.89 for the model. The patient on the right had a much lower score, and you can clearly see that the patient on the right has a thinner, slimmer body habitus versus the patient on the left. Now you might be saying, well, what's the point of this? We already have all these tools to screen for diabetes, but what's very interesting is that there are many criteria and guidelines, but they differ significantly. And so there have been randomized trials that have shown that screening for type 2 diabetes doesn't really reduce mortality after 10 years. Some data that says there may be a benefit after 23 to 30 years. And lifestyle and pharmacological changes, though, which is kind of confusing, can actually help, right? So the conflict here, what I take away from this is that basically we don't have really great screening protocols for diabetes. And that screening could improve and potentially also improve the outcome. We don't have that. There is a statement from the US Preventive Service Task Force that recommends screening for abnormal glucose type 1 and type 2 diabetes in patients 40 to 70 who are overweight and obese. We just showed that just using the BMI by itself is not a great predictor of diabetes. So BMI alone doesn't really solve the problem. There are some other metrics you can consider, but the point is that they're not always there or readily available to be used. So AI can help us improve this opportunistically. So here is a time-dependent ROC curve, just like the curve I showed you before. And what we're seeing here is basically we can make these DL predictions, and we have in our data set, we have about 10 years worth of data on these patients. And we can see that basically the performance of our model persists throughout these years. So making prediction early on, maybe 5-6 years before the diagnosis, that the model consistently predicts the same things. We have patients who have multiple chest x-rays over a period of time, and those predictions from the DL model remain relatively stable. They don't really change that much, which I think is very interesting. I mean, it's a very useful thing about this, is that unlike, let's say, an A1C or a blood glucose level, which has limited utility beyond a certain amount of time, that this tends to have a longer amount of utility over a period of time. So let's switch over to a different biomarker, vascular disease. And specifically, we're going to talk about aortic atherosclerosis. So this is an 87-year-old patient that has vascular disease. I don't know if you could see this, but they have this white calcification in the aorta. The aorta is tortuous. And it's quite obvious. I mean, most radiologists see this and mention it, but it's frequently not reported in x-ray simply because there's not enough time. So the average read time for chest x-ray is around 1.5 minutes, not very much time for a person to really produce a lot of extra extraneous findings or verbiage in the report. And it's important because that patients that have this established risk for atherosclerotic disease do have a significant increased risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular event. And so not having this code, we actually found was being a disparity. So basically, if patients, for example, didn't speak English or a different race, didn't have enough access to the healthcare system, you could see that this doesn't get documented and it doesn't get treated. And that's the importance about this. Here is another model we looked at. So we took about 800 patients that had COVID. And what we did here is we looked at race and the comorbidities associated with it. So we have here on the left what the AI model would predict for those patients using the chest X-ray. And on the right is an odds ratio plot of the EMR, the data from the medical record. And what we can see here is that there's a significant variation in the odds ratio of this one code. And this is the 85 code referring to congestive heart failure. So the patients that are now white, the AI is predicting basically a significantly higher scores for congestive heart failure versus the EMR data, which doesn't seem to show that same appearance. And here we can take an example to show what this looks like. We have a 65-year-old self-reported Hispanic woman who speaks only Spanish, and she had COVID and no diagnosis of CHF, and she has a considerably enlarged heart. What's interesting about this is the patient did actually have an echocardiogram ordered, but never got completed. So the patient also has a history of diabetes, was non-compliant with medications, and was living in kind of an area of high social deprivation. So this is an important point that AI can kind of point these things out and basically help identify these higher risk patients that may not have been fully treated or gotten the appropriate treatment at the time. And we can do the same thing. Instead of looking at race, we can look at language. So we can see patients that don't speak English, the same discrepancy versus the ones that do speak English. Again, we can see that that same kind of discrepancy appears between the AI predictions and the EMR data. So my take-home points are value-based healthcare will slowly replace fee-for-service models. The ICDs and HCC codes are an excellent source for supervised machine learning. They're great for feature engineering. There are many cases already in your system. You just have to simply get access to them. Early detection and management of these comorbidities are more important ever for providers and healthcare systems. DL modeling can predict the relevant patient comorbidities from medical imaging rapidly, allowing new insights like health disparities. Using imaging biomarkers that can align with risk adjustment can help with adoption and validation. So many of the people I have conversations with administration always love to talk about this thing, something that clinicians don't really take much interest, or researchers, but I think if you guys do, I think it's a very good way to approach your superiors and tell them all these wonderful things you can do to help them rein in costs and do a better job managing patients. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. Maybe I'll start off the questions. And so, yes, I was very interested in your time-dependent RC curves that you showed for diabetes, but I didn't understand how you calculated those. You showed RC curves, and then you said something about 10-year window, but what exactly were you showing? What was the task?
Yeah, so basically this RC curve, I have to go back real quick. I apologize, I went through it quickly. But basically you can, we did this in R, and you can actually calculate, and this wasn't the full data set, unfortunately, running this on my laptop, this actually is a time-consuming task to actually calculate. But what it does, it calculates the curve at multiple time intervals. And so it will actually generate a table, which doesn't look as good as the graph, but basically you're getting multiple graphs over multiple time points. So I think this one went out to 5,000 days approximately, and it shows basically AUC is essentially persistent. It's kind of like survival analysis. So basically what AUC we have initially and what AUC we end at doesn't really change all that much. And we also did some further validation of this too by looking at patients that had more than one chest X-ray over a multi-year period and comparing the results, doing like a pair t-test, and a very similar kind of result where basically the biomarkers that were predicted from the chest X-ray don't really change a tremendous amount.
Okay, thank you. All right, I have another question. So from your talk, it seemed that AI would be potentially very helpful in diagnosing all these like incidental findings, right? On chest X-ray, for example, you were talking about the atherosclerotic disease, or diagnosing diabetes, but how would you have you know, sort of a know-it-all type of AI? How would you train that, and how could you like potentially
Right.
validate that in clinical practice?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the real use, I think the real utility about this is the way we've been trying to implement this in our practice is as a gap list. So we're basically the diagnosis is being detected by the model, but it's not being obviously documented in the chart. And I think that's an important point, that we're not obviously trying to generate these diagnoses without having human validation. And the intent here is basically, for example, atherosclerosis. That's something that radiologists can see and document it. Sometimes we fail to document it. So it's more of a QA issue. If we can get that information back to the radiologist and say, hey, maybe did you mean to put this in there? Did you forget to put it in there? That's one way of dealing with that aspect. As far as the diabetes, for example, that's a bit more involved. I think we're looking at ways of looking to see obviously what has been ordered. So you can check the EMR, see if they've had any tests or lab work done, and then go the step further, possibly, and alert the physician and say, hey, look, there's a potential here that this patient might be at a higher risk. Maybe you should consider screening them sooner than later. But there needs to be obviously some more work to look at the outcomes there. But I think that is kind of the approach to take these as essentially clinical decision support tools, right? They're not going to make the diagnosis really, but they're going to kind of help identify these higher risk patients that are basically not getting the care they need.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. So if anybody still has unanswered questions, please type. In the meantime, I don't know if you know much about, but in your references at some point you said something about predicting biological age.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so this has kind of become an interesting topic. So the idea is that you can predict, in our model, the model I have here was doing this, basically predicting actually the age of a person off of their chest radiograph. And so there's some interesting stuff. In medical school, they sometimes say the patient looks older than their stated age. So appearance is older than stated age. And there's been some work on this where there actually is some truth to this. If patient looks older than they really are, that's not a good thing. And so people have gotten into this a little bit. And so there have been a couple papers that have looked at this, and having a predicted biological age greater than chronologic age is a risk factor for many of these comorbidities and poor health outcomes. Now, is it better than other biomarkers? I'm not really, when we did our studies initially, we didn't find it was much better. We actually tried using it, for example, the COVID situation. It didn't outperform the other markers, but it is a potential marker. And I think people are very interested in it, but most of what it's picking up in the age prediction ends up being the very same things we see in cardiovascular disease, arthritis. There's a lot of very similar attributes to the prediction that we see in other predictions. So it's picking up on the things that we already are looking at in some of these other areas.
Okay, that's very interesting. So there is a question from in the Q&A now. So it's outside of chest X-rays, what imaging modalities would you say show the most promise for population health studies?
Yeah, very good question. So definitely abdomen and pelvis. So this is where Dr. Pickhart's worked a tremendous amount. So the abdomen and pelvis has a tremendous amount of signal. We can look at liver, pancreas, and there's a litany of these out there. And then the next are actually, I think it's not as much signal, but potentially has a lot of utilities. Mammography. I mean, we can pick up a vascular disease in mammography. Other diseases, I'm not so sure how much we can do, but I think there is potential there. And the reason why is mammography is extensively used. Like I was mentioning before, it's a study that almost half the population is going to get at some point. And it would be another one that would be, I think, worth looking at. But really, it's abdomen and pelvis. And then beyond that, the brain, there are multiple models out there that look at volumetrics, which we know about, like brain age. So looking at brain volume loss, so akin to what we're talking about with chronologic and biologic age. So if your brain has atrophy at a younger age than it should, this is obviously prognostically a bad sign. And so that's another area that's been looked at extensively as well.
Great. So there's another question in the chat. It says, it is difficult to grasp the potential implementation of the paradigm in a large patient cohort, such as a city or even a whole state? What are the obstacles?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So just getting the data to run it on doing this model we ran on our patient population, it's somewhat costly. You need a server, and you need to have some infrastructure, and you need to have people to help you do that, move the images across. So there are definitely infrastructure issues. I think there is hope. Many of these companies out there, I think Zebra is one of these AI companies that was bought, and for the intent of doing this kind of work, AI Doc. There are many of these places that are interested in doing this, but the problem is that, as you know, most of these things are done on a practice by practice or hospital by hospital basis. So unless there's a unifying repository of data, which in the US doesn't really happen, we have a very fragmented system. It's not going to be one of those things where we can easily run across the whole of the US, right? It's potentially maybe more doable, like in a VA system. But at some point, though, I think what the motivating factor will be is many systems will probably, because of value-based healthcare, will have more interest in doing these kinds of things to help identify higher risk patients. So I think that definitely is something that will motivate many of these practices to use them. And many of these services are now in the cloud, so they don't require necessarily a lot of infrastructure. You set up a kind of a link to these systems, and then essentially you can then have the data analyzed in that kind of fashion. And so that is actually a nice option. And I think that will become the more common way of doing it.
Great. So there's another question, which is, can you emphasize a patient-centered approach? Patients voluntarily upload imaging and receive a risk report.
Yeah, and that's been done. There actually are some sites. Actually, the what we talked about, the biological and chronological age, there was a site. I don't think it's still on there. I think it was like chestxrayage.com. But you could actually upload your own chest X-ray, get a predicted age. Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. And I think Zebra, the other company I was mentioning before they got bought, was doing something like that, where you could upload your own CT scan and get back a report. But unfortunately, I'm not sure how many people will partake. So most of the people doing that tend to be, I think, people where you consider earlier adopters, maybe not the population you want to reach. The areas, I think the areas that we're most interested in population health tend to be older patients. Sometimes, obviously, with social disparities, it's these economic adversity issues where they cannot necessarily get access, so they wouldn't necessarily have that ability to do it. But the point being is, yeah, I think that is an option, but I'm not sure if it's going to have unfortunately, the broadest appeal across the healthcare landscape.
Okay, great. I don't see any further questions, so I'd like to thank our speaker again for an excellent presentation. I'd like to thank the audience for their participation. And please join us again next month in June. Dr. Kim will be giving a presentation. Oh, there's another question.
Oh, sure.
But yeah.
Go ahead.
The average chest X-ray dose is in millisievert. Would you consider this strategy as a screening rather than a diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't advocate at this point getting a chest X-ray just to do this. I think that is a question that's come up. I do think, though, opportunistically, it does make a lot of sense. The fact that if you already had a chest X-ray, which a lot of people did get during the COVID pandemic, right? The very common thing to come in, cough, fever, they get a chest X-ray. So that actually is something of utility. And another point is that the X-ray, even if it's a year or two old, will still have some predictive value. So I think that makes the most sense. At some point, yes, the question is it worth doing this as a screening tool? And this has been done. People were doing these kind of whole body scans for a while. It was in vogue maybe about 15 years ago, to kind of scope out their whole, all their anatomy, pick up on these random little nodules. And unfortunately, it didn't really take hold. So I don't think at this point there's probably enough evidence. I mean, things like mammography, lung cancer screening, there's been heavy investment in the government to really advocate for patients to get these things done. So it takes a lot of advertisement, a lot of work to get patients in to do these kinds of things. And so I think we're still not there yet, but at some point, I think really the opportunistic aspect will happen. That will definitely happen in the near future.
Okay, great. Going once, going twice. No more questions. Okay,
no more questions.
So
that's it.
No more questions. That's it. So Dr. Kim will be giving our June seminar, so please join us again then. It'll be on predictive values of quantitative CT lung COVID scores. So thank you all and see you next time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.